Good afternoon. Welcome to our first Ask Her webinar. Ask Her is an interview series with women leaders, our partners, community members and supporters who work tirelessly for women and girls. We'll be having in-depth conversations around complex issues affecting our community and centering gender, race, and economic justice. I'm Martine Sadarangani Gordon, Vice President of Programs at Washington Area Women's Foundation. We are a community-supported foundation that invests in the power of women and girls in the DC region. And we know that by creating opportunities for and increasing resources to women and girls of color in our region, we can and will dismantle barriers to economic security. Today, we're talking about the power of women's foundations and the role we play to make lasting change. We'll also talk about philanthropy, how it can improve, and how we center women and girls of color in our organizations and in the work that we do. During our chat today, we'd like to encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A box. We also encourage you to use your social media platforms to share the gems you hear today using the hashtag AskHerSeries. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, Teresa C. Younger, President and CEO of Miss Foundation for Women. She is an activist, advocate, organizational strategist, and proven philanthropic and policy leader. After 20 years on the front lines for the fight for comprehensive equity and the elimination of institutional oppression, she joined the Miss Foundation for Women as their president and CEO. Teresa previously served as the executive director of the Connecticut General Assembly's Permanent Commission on the Status of Women and as the executive director of the ACLU of Connecticut. She is a graduate of the University of North Dakota, was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of New Haven, and she is a proud lifetime Girl Scout and Gold Award recipient. Welcome, Teresa. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Martine. I'm really excited to be with you all today.
Wonderful. We're excited to talk with you. Let's start with just a little bit more about you. How did you land at Miss Foundation?
So, you gave a really quick version of my history. What people need to know is growing up, I was a forever activist, right? I was always standing up and trying to create a world that was more fair. And growing up as a Girl Scout, I was definitely somebody who believed in making the world a better place. And so I didn't come to this work in kind of the way most people might come with like a PhD or a master's degree in women's studies. I actually came to this work because I wanted to make a change in the lives of women and girls, but mostly girls, and came to it from a position around youth development. And my degree is in recreation. And I really understood and wanted to run children's nonprofits, which I did for a number of years. And in that process, really saw the racial and economic disparities that were going on with those young folks living in urban environments, and felt like it was really important that I reposition the work that I wanted to do to a much broader conversation. So then I went to the ACLU. I ran the ACLU of Connecticut, and then I worked at the National ACLU office in New York right around 9/11. And what I learned during that time as I was trying to organize in Connecticut was it was women who were changing their communities so blatantly, and yet nobody was talking about them. They were the ones who were convincing their sons and their partners and their husbands and their brothers about the work that needed to happen within the communities, what their rights were and what was going on. And I just remember recognizing in that moment what I had always known, which is women's leadership comes from within and then has to be shown up without. And so it was really an interesting moment where I thought I really would like to be more concentrated in that space. And then went to Connecticut, back into Connecticut after working in New York, and got to do policy work for the state of Connecticut. The Women's Commission at that time was a public arm of the legislative branch. So we worked within the legislature, and I spent 8 years there working within the legislature, passing legislation, working and writing legislation, organizing the women in Connecticut, amplifying the voices from my own experiences as a woman of color. And I knew I wanted to do something that was just a little bit bigger. And it also felt like philanthropy had some room for growth. So when the Ms. Foundation position opened up, I put together my resume, I went in for the interview, and what I found was really very interesting, which was here was a legacy organization that at the time was about 40 years old, that, had just a few women of color in its leadership, and who hadn't fully embraced the impact that policy might have, but were really had supported thousands of organizations across the country for its 40-year legacy. And so, I felt like I had worked in government, I had worked in nonprofit, I had worked in youth development. It seemed like philanthropy was the next natural spot for me to step into. And so I did. 6 years ago, I started at the Ms. Foundation, and we have had a journey since then.
Indeed. I think philanthropy in general is on a journey. You said philanthropy had some room for growth, was one of the thought processes behind joining the Ms. Foundation. Let's talk about that room for growth. It's been 6 years, but that's not that long of a time in the grand scheme of things. So what about philanthropy prompts you to say had some room for growth 6 years ago? Are those things still the same now? And specifically for women's foundations, if we're there, Ms. Foundation is the oldest women's foundation in the country. There are now more than 100 women's foundations across the United States. You said in your intro, it was women who were changing the community. So we know that women demonstrate their own leadership, but what about women's foundations is just different than how other methods of philanthropy work, and how has that work evolved over time?
Yeah, so I think we have to fully acknowledge that the women's funding community today is not where it started, right? When the Ms. Foundation started 47 years ago, 46 years ago, it really started around the premise of consciousness raising, right? Just having this conversation. We didn't have data points back then. We didn't have laws on the books that protected women, that even, barely acknowledged gender. And so, the conversations back then were very different. And at that point, nobody was positioning the experiences of women at the center of any conversation at all, right? So everything was considered private and personal, and that was over there. And what the Ms. Foundation's premise was, even back then, was how do we build our collective power? How do we come into this space and recognize that it is not incumbent on any one person to do this, but how do we do it collectively? How do we validate the experiences that women were having throughout the country? How do we come together? How do we recognize that it's not going to happen, all of it, out of a federal government form, but really recognize that there's so much work happening in communities, right? So those early days around philanthropy and the Ms. Foundation and where women's funds were coming in was far different than it is today. And public women's foundations like Washington area and the Ms. Foundation are also different than private philanthropy and big institutions, right? Because we are organizations that raise our dollars, prioritize where we want them to go, and then move them out into community the way community has expected them. Big philanthropy was not doing that. First off, 40 plus years ago, big philanthropy didn't even recognize gender, right? The measure of impact wasn't there. Nobody was talking about what women and girls needed. Everything got kind of grouped together. And even 6 years ago, things were grouped together. And we're in a new moment in time because we've really seen a shift of women's power, where women's impact is, and what we want to see happen. And so, one of the things that I say is public philanthropy and a feminist approach to philanthropy actually changes the dynamics. And it does rest in understanding that we are not supposed to have the answers, and that we need to listen to those closest to the ground, those doing the work. And we then need to create space for them. And, and I think that's a very, very different process than what private philanthropy has done in the past. And so it's really been an interesting mechanism to look at how far we've come, right? There was a time when philanthropy, particularly women's philanthropy, was about ladies who lunched, right? they, I don't want to offend anybody who happens to be listening, but, first off, second wave white feminist philanthropy was very different than it is today. And it was about women whose husband went to work all day. They may have done something in the community, but they wanted to do something that made them feel good, right? It kind of gave a savior complex in some of the things that were happening. We're going to help those people over there. Oh, it might be us, but we're going to help those people over there. That's no longer the case in many kinds of women's funds across the country. Now it's about how do we make the systemic change we need to make? What does that look like? And how are we pushing and challenging philanthropy more broadly to listen to the grassroots, where it needs to invest, to see women's foundations, which oftentimes are mostly women, right? From various different backgrounds who are coming together and finding a shared story, finding shared theory and practice that they want to participate together in. It's about informing and educating communities, lifting up the voice of those in the community. It's very different kinds of approaches to what's happening. And I think, much of traditional philanthropy is top down. Here's what we think should happen, and it can be because private philanthropy isn't accountable to community the way public philanthropy is, right? So it's, we want you to do this, here's what we want you to do. Now, who's going to do it our way, right? As opposed to, what is the problem that we see? You tell us how you might respond to that concern, to that challenge, and what does that look like? And so I think there's been some real changes in the ground, in the conversations and the theories and the thoughts, and it's been far more documented in the past several years around what we need to be doing. When I started at Ms., one of the first things that I did was a listening tour. And part of that listening tour was because I knew what was happening in the state of Connecticut. I knew, having been raised in North Dakota, what it was like to be a little Black girl in a very white dominant community. But I didn't know what was happening across the country. And so I went on a listening tour, and that is one of the things when I talk to Gloria Steinem, it's one of the things she talks about too, which is when you go out to listen, not to direct the conversation, you really do hear so much of what's on people's hearts and what they're thinking. And it really did inform the direction that the Ms. Foundation has taken in the past few years.
That's great. I know in our local, obviously localized work, much of our work is focused around listening to community, making sure that we're contextualizing the research and the data points we see and getting the anecdotes. I want to pull on something that you said specifically, though. You talked about the feminist principles of philanthropy, and you've mentioned this before. You mentioned this in a recent Forbes article, and I just want to highlight something that you started to talk about a little bit and just pull it out to the forefront a little bit more. The word feminism. I mean, I think, so Ms. Foundation has this campaign, My Feminism Is. You do actively talk about feminist principles of philanthropy. Let's pull on that a little bit more. What are feminist principles of philanthropy? And, at some point, how do we sort of grapple with the history of feminism being white-led, a cis-led movement, not necessarily inclusive of women of color, of trans women, of other genders. And, I think you and our president and CEO, Jennifer Lockwood-Chabot, have talked about how do we reclaim that word feminism. We talk about that at our staff as well. How do we reclaim it? How has Ms. Foundation sought to do that?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that question, Martine, because it's actually where I started when I got to Ms. So what that listening tour did that I just mentioned was it actually allowed me to sit at tables where I could listen and hear from people about what Ms. was not and was to them, and what feminism was and wasn't to them. And I would basically go into communities and say, you set the table, I just want to listen. And it was a wonderful way to engage people. But what I heard was how many people felt left out of movements that were supposed to be designed for them. And it was, and this is where words matter, right? And so I've heard from the trans community, they would say things like, we don't feel safe, and you've never had us at the table. You don't even include us in the conversation. I heard from men, we're not included in the conversation. I heard from young women, you're talking about feminism that's not even related to us. I heard from women of color who said, I believe in Black feminism, but I don't believe in the binary that the definition is giving to us. And when I got back to the Ms. Foundation offices after almost a year traveling around the country, I said, people want to own a word that is something they understand. And we need to reclaim the word. So we actually did a survey, we did some polling, and said to people, do you consider yourself a feminist? And 16% of people that we polled, and it was one of the most diverse polls that had ever been done, actually said at that time, 16% said they considered themselves a feminist. And then we asked them, do you believe in the social, political, and economic equality of all genders? So pushing back the gender binary of all genders, do you believe in feminism? And all of a sudden, the number jumped up to 86%, right? So when we started to parse apart the fact that we were really looking at an intersectional approach to the word, what we wanted to break out of the binary and make it more inclusive as we could at the moment, to say all genders, right? So then we could get into inviting all folks in, right? People could see themselves in the language we were using. All of a sudden, we were seeing people who were going, oh, I think you're talking about me. And representation matters, right? I'm the second Black woman to lead the Ms. Foundation for Women in its 47-year history. So all of a sudden, we had communities of color also looking at leadership and saying, oh, wait, that's what Ms. looks like now. That's what we're talking about. And we're using language that's far more inclusive, and we're being intentional about what we're saying. We do not at the Ms. Foundation work on women's issues. We work on the issues that affect the lives of women and their communities. Why is that important? Because when I sat down with young women and they said to me, every time you say women's issues, you limit the conversation, and every time you say women and families, you assume everything is happening with our uterus, right? And so I was like, oh, wait, you've got a really good point there. And so when we asked the question in this poll that we did, what were women's issues? We got abortion, we got pay equity, and we got healthcare, or childcare. When we asked about what were the issues that affect the lives of women and their communities, we got education and transportation and economic development and welfare. I mean, we got a whole litany of issues. We went from 3 issues to 13. So, and we also at the Ms. Foundation don't work on, don't work towards the women's movement, but rather the movements that affect the lives of women. So we really wanted to create space that words were intentional. And for us, when we say feminism, and we did a campaign, we asked people to define when they defined as a feminist, what does feminism mean to them? We called in all folks, right? We stepped back and looked at the vision of the Ms. Foundation ourselves and said, how are we calling in, not calling out, right? For a long time, the women's space and the feminist movement space meant you had to have a PhD in order to be engaged in the conversation. And I believe in, real life feminism. My aunts, my grandmothers, my moms, my brothers, people who are living with the values that I share in movements towards gender equity and equality. And so for me, we have embraced this term feminism. We have, what we said is we actually have to use it, and we actually have to clarify it, right? So when we say it, we define it. This is the social, political, and economic equality of all genders. And we invite you into that conversation. Tell us why that doesn't work. And it may not work forever, but it works for now. And then we did the My Feminism Is campaign. We did Feminist of the Year campaign. We really started asking folks, and in the United States, we have to just recognize the word feminism is seen very differently, and feminist is very different than in a more global community. When I talk to women from around the world, they define themselves up front as a feminist. In the United States, we don't define ourselves up front as that. So we need to own the word and own it in a way that actually is representative of the world we're trying to create.
I really like generally, obviously what you're saying about language and representation mattering, how you did the survey and you asked essentially, the goal of getting a certain set of data, but then when you ask it differently, the language mattered, right? People saw themselves suddenly in the question versus the previous question. And you mentioned that people felt left out of the conversation. And we know that, that was obviously before COVID, it was before the pandemic, it was before all of the sort of, we'll say racial reckoning that we've been going through this year, if not longer. People felt left out before. And so now in this moment, with all of these things going on, I know that philanthropy as a sector is trying to behave differently, almost being forced to behave differently. If people felt left out before, how do they feel now, potentially? And I know that at Washington Women's Foundation, we've tried to use this moment as a catalyst to shift our own grant making in ways that we had wanted to and maybe didn't feel like we had the runway to do so before, trust-based approaches, reducing burden on grantee partners, things like that, the sector's been talking about for a long time to be more inclusive. But from your perspective, going back, we talked a little bit about what was going on with philanthropy when you first started the Miss Foundation and what you were seeing. Right now in this moment in 2020, what role can women's foundations play in leading the change so that people can feel included, so that we can intentionally use our language and representation in a way that can improve the sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, first I want to make sure that people understand that at the Ms. Foundation, we're about calling in, not calling out, right? So we are not trying to exclude people from a conversation. In fact, we're really intentional in the words that we use. So our vision is of a safe and just world where power and possibility are not limited by race, gender, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, or age. We believe that equity and inclusion are the cornerstones of a true democracy in which the worth and dignity of every person is valued. And so one of the things that we hold is that if we believe in a safe and just world where power and possibility are not limited, and we spell out by whom, right, to whom it is not limited, we then create a space. So one of the things that we say all the time is you have to be really intentional about the language that you use. You can't say, we did a new strategic plan 2 years ago, and in that new strategic plan, we were intentional about the fact that we do not have enough dollars to impact everything in the world. But there are broken parts of philanthropy that need to be fixed. And so we want to be intentional about where we drop our pebble into the pool of inequality. And we will drop our pebble over women and girls of color. And as we drop our pebble, the ripples in the pool of inequality will affect everybody else in that pool. And so we were being really intentional about the language we wanted to use and what we wanted to say. And one of the things that we think philanthropy more broadly has to do is to stop funding projects and fund general operating support, which means that you have to trust the organizations that you are giving dollars to, i.e. trust the leadership of those organizations. And for women's funds and spaces that are very intentional around gender justice, then you have to be intentional about what you are talking about, right? So don't just fund reading programs and literacy programs, actually fund the breadth of the work that these organizations are doing. So we stop siloing our work. We actually say that we fund movement building under what we call our SHE core, safety, health, and economic justice. All those things are tied together. They are not one separately pulled out from another. We recognize that women's lives are completely integrated and connected, and we need to recognize that. And so funders actually need to do that also. When we talk about feminist philanthropy or the principles of philanthropy, we talk about and trust-based philanthropy. We talk about the fact that you have to make your grants more broadly. You need to make your grants, the reality is that, sexism, racism, patriarchy, white supremacy, et cetera, did not happen overnight. So we have to stop thinking that if we give you a grant today, you're going to change everything tomorrow in 1 year. So what does multi-year commitments to an organization look like? And that's really, really important. And we need to give organizations the flexibility to pay their staff, right? So many foundations and people go, well, how much is that CEO making? In most nonprofits under $500,000, the CEO is making $50,000, which is not a livable wage in most places in this country. And we are asking them to be on call all the time. So what would happen if we actually set a livable standard for those working in the nonprofit sector and recognize the importance of the nonprofit sector, right? And so there's a whole conversation to be happening there. And we also need to support policy change. We can't just say, we're going to feed people, but then not show up at City Hall or at budget meetings or, on a national level to make sure that the safety net supports are provided for, right? So we need to really look at what role philanthropy is supposed to play. And then we need to recognize that also that philanthropy is not just about moving money. For us, it's about having an impact. So how are we supporting the leadership of the organizations that are doing the work? And how are we letting them determine what that work needs to look like? And so, philanthropy, more broadly, needs to adopt some of those principles. We need to give multi-year grants. We need to give general operating support. We need to hold flexibility. Like right now, during this COVID time, we saw these foundations saying, oh, you can be more flexible. We need to create simple and non-onerous ways of applying for grants, right? And then what are the reports that we're looking for? And why are we reporting year to year? Why don't we report 1 to 3 years? So we can give people room to actually do the work they need to do, as opposed to filling out the report that they need to have, that they are looking to get to their funder. And that's where the importance of women's foundations have really stepped in. Washington area, the Ms. Foundation, we're intermediaries. People can give their dollars to organizations like us, and we move them to the grassroots. And we do it so that every organization doesn't have to present a report to every single foundation, right? They can present the report to us, we put that together, and then we report it out. And that actually saves nonprofits. They are not, the nonprofit industrial complex is not designed to just meet what philanthropy is demanding of it. And also when we talk about women's foundations and public foundations, we're talking about collective power. So how are we all coming together? Your dollar and my dollar actually goes much further if we do it together and we identify what that looks like. And that's really what's so important when we're looking at philanthropy.
Yes, the leverage piece, absolutely. We have a board member at Washington Women's Foundation who says, we fund the hard stuff, we do the hard stuff. Simple way of saying it. But I can't move forward with the conversation because much of what you're saying is embedded in what Ms. Foundation does, but it's also within the report you all released yesterday, Pocket Change, How Women and Girls of Color Do More with Less. And so I have to ask about the report because we transitioned me right into it, Teresa. So right up front in the report, in the executive summary, it states, philanthropy was not created with or for women of color in mind, but the field has evolved rapidly in the past few years. There are donors committed to women and girls of color and their funding, yet organizations on the ground are not always able to identify this support. This is much of what we've been talking about. you talked a little bit about what are some of the actions recommended for funders in the report that could shift the power dynamics so that women and girls of color could access funding. You talked about multi-year funding, general operating. You talked about working with intermediaries who know the space and can, fund the hard stuff that maybe other funders can't. But specifically to shifting those power dynamics, how can philanthropy operate differently so that women of color can have the access that they haven't previously had?
Yeah, so we, in this report, and everybody should go up to forwomen.org and pull down the report, because it's actually so packed with information about how women and girls of color are being funded across the country. And what we found in that report was that on average, $5.48 were going to each woman and girl of color in this country through philanthropy. That's less than half of 1% going to women and girls of color. So, the reality is they are doing more with less. And what we found was when we talked with almost 1,000 grassroots organizations and about 23 different funding organizations who said they funded women and girls of color. And when we started looking, we found that there were three things that foundations could do. One, they could actually name what they are looking for. What we heard from grantee partners was that they couldn't find who was funding women and girls of color because nobody was saying it. And then foundations were saying, well, but we're doing it, right? But if you don't say it, right, at the Ms. Foundation, we center our work around women and girls of color. That's what we do. It's not exclusive, it is inclusive, but that's what we do. So when you're coming to us, that's a starting point. So naming it is one of the key things that we think philanthropy must do. They have to report it and they have to name it so that people know what they're looking for. Then we are asking that they increase it. They increase the amount of dollars that they think they are getting. Because if the allocation of $5.48 is what we think we're going to be able to make the change in this country, we're sadly mistaken. And let's just be really clear. It has been women of color who have led almost every social justice movement, institution, and organization and movement in this country. It has been women and girls of color who have moved almost every single movement in this country, including what is happening right now. Black Lives Matter was started, right, by women of color, intentionally by Black women. So let's not get confused about who's doing the work on the ground. So we need to increase the amount of dollars, we need to name the amount of dollars, and then we need to track the amount of dollars. So we actually need, one of the things we keep finding out is like, nobody's really tracking it. Oh yeah, we gave money to women and girls. That's great, but that's actually, are you reporting it? Are you talking about it? We gave money to women and girls is one thing, because we know that the majority of dollars that go to women and girls in this country go towards healthcare. The majority of those dollars go towards health research, primarily around cancer. Yes. However, when we start going deeper and deeper and deeper, we find that the money is not going to women and girls of color. It's not going to movement building strategies. It's not going to policy and advocacy. So we actually have to be intentional about what are the dollars going to women and girls of color. We need to report out what organizations those are so that people can see where their dollars are going and they can also follow those organizations. And so those are the top three things out of the report are name it, track it, and increase it, because that's what we need to do. And if we want to have the impact we want to have as philanthropy, we need to do that. We need to be intentional about what we're doing. And being intentional, people oftentimes say like, you're leaving people out. No, we're actually adding people in. That statement at the front half of the report that says, that you read, which is so rightly so, which is, this was not designed for us or by us. Most of the work in this country was not designed for us or by us. The Constitution was not written for us or by us. And so, we have to go in and re-envision and then dismantle the systems that are set up for us. If you read the front of our strategic plan, you also hear these very same kinds of words, right? We call out white supremacy and patriarchy and racism and sexism and homophobia and xenophobia and transphobia. We call out all of those things because those are realities to the life we are leading, and they are not designed to be inclusive. And so we make that happen, we have to take these steps. So when people say they're giving money to women and girls, I say, what percentage of your budget? When they say they're giving money to women and girls of color, what percentage of your budget? Has it increased? How many of them are you giving general operating support? I mean, we just have to ask the question. And, you know, one of the things that the Ms. Foundation can do, and Washington area I know has done, which is ask the question of philanthropy. You can talk a game, but are you really doing it, right? And how much are we really trusting in the work we're trying to do?
I want to target in on a specific issue, and I know it's not a women's issue, so but it is something that does impact a lot of women's lives, and when we talk about gender-based violence, right? And to your point about, you know, an issue area that disproportionately impacts women of color, that is historically grossly underfunded in regard to prevention and survivor supports. But Ms. Foundation was one of the very first funders of domestic violence shelters, of sexual assault hotlines. And here we are 40 plus years later, and, you know, gender-based violence continues to be, of course, a problem. Particularly, you know, there are particularly more headlines right now in the midst of COVID and sheltering at home. We at the Washington Area Women's Foundation were very pleased to be able to invest more in women's safety in the DC region in the past few years. But including making it one of our, just to clarify, including making it one of our primary focuses for our emergency response fund, the Stand Together Fund. But I want you know, in regard to calling out other funders, what would you say to other donors, other funders who are interested in investing in gender-based violence prevention, in survivor supports in their community? But who should they talk to? And what issues should they be sensitive to when trying to start in this work? And then for those of us who are investing in it, you know, how can we better call out our colleagues to really get the questions answered about, you know, why are these issues things that have been underfunded for so long?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I want to kind of roll back a little bit the conversation. Yes, absolutely. The first work the Ms. Foundation ever funded was a call center around domestic violence. Let's just understand that as long as we consider domestic violence a behind the closed door conversation, it never gets the recognition that it needs to have. And so it never gets the funding that it needs to have. And so I think that's like one thing we need to fully acknowledge is that still we don't talk about gender-based violence the way we should. Let's talk about the interconnected realities around violence in this country and around safety more appropriately, right? And so what does it take to be safe? We need economic security, we need appropriate housing, we need safety nets, we need to actually change behavior that actually leads to the gender-based violence that we're talking about. But let's, like, you know, we're in this moment of what violence is, let's talk about what safety is, right? That violence that's happening through domestic violence is very much based on what's happening right now, right? This moment that we're in around police brutality and state-sponsored violence is real. And we need to have a conversation that's much broader around safety, emotional, sexual, all of the aspects of what that looks like so that they are completely integrated in a conversation. And we're not, we're kind of saying, oh, that happens over here, or that happens over there, and we're not putting it all together, right? We need to actually be really, we need to raise the question. So you asked the right question, which is how do we call people out when they're not doing it right? Absolutely. we need to call them out, but we need to actually expand the conversation. We continue to use the language that is being given to us. Domestic violence doesn't just happen in the home. We have a completely militarized country. And so, you know, we have police forces that are predicated on a military basis, and we still have, however you believe on the Second Amendment, we still have this idea that people need to protect their own, people don't need to come into it. We're still not calling out all of the violence and infringements on safety. We have done very little commitment to actually changing the narrative and the behavior and the culture in our society. So it's much broader than the limited conversation we're having. And I really stop the conversation around gender-based violence and domestic violence, because I think we actually have to have a broader conversation, right? And it needs to be more inclusive of what we're talking about. Nobody is really having not nobody. There are lots of groups that are having the conversation, including Washington area. But I think we have to like step in spaces where we're being left out. So I say all the time, you know, there are tables, find a seat at the table. If you can't find a seat at the table, right, then you have to bring your own chair. If you can't add another chair to the table, then take the table out. And if that doesn't work, set your own table. And that is what we get to do, right? So, you know, this idea that, you know, funding alternative shelters and housing for those women who do not have the economic security to leave their abusers, or there's a whole bunch that gets wrapped up into that, right? That we actually need to, what happens if we reimagine all of that? What happens if we go to the imagination of not helping them, but creating a world that is no longer violent?
It also goes back to your point about you're not calling it women's issues, right? Because there's so much more of a holistic picture of a woman's life and a person's life.
Well, you're right. When we limit the conversation to just one or two things, then we don't expand out the conversation. I want to talk about safety, right? I want to talk about safety in the context of our trans brothers and sisters, of a Breonna Taylor, right? And there are a list of names, the Say Her Name campaign around the country. There are so many trans women of color who are brutally murdered in this country out of the fear and out of the ignorance of so many out there, right? And we're not having that conversation when we're having this conversation over here around domestic violence, because we've separated those conversations around safety. We're not having a conversation about why is the prevalence of domestic violence now higher than it was before COVID-19. Then we need to have an actual conversation around economic security and what has happened and what stress looks like and how we as a society are addressing those issues. And you know, this goes to the reality that when you have just one set of people making decisions, they are not inclusive of other people, right? And so what we are seeing now is, you know, if there had been more women at the table with more diversified experiences and more people at the table with more diversified experiences, we might be having a different conversation right now about what that looks like and how we are approaching that and what kinds of systems we want to put in place. I mean, I actually am much more optimistic than some about this time, because I do believe we are getting more and more people able to question the structures that we have, that were not designed for us or by us, so we need to redesign them. And let's take them down and rebuild them up with more voices at the table to build systems, not fix the systems, but rebuild the systems that are out there. And that's what we can do. That's what Ms. is trying to do with our support of building movement structures and helping to amplify, shape, and change narrative and culture in this country.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I want to bring our guests, our audience, into the conversation, you know, so they can have the benefit of your insight as well. I'm going to ask that Mercy Chikaware, our communications manager at Washington Women's Foundation, help us out with that a little bit. She's been manning or womaning, if you will, the questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to add more to those of you who a question pops into your head as we're continuing to chat. Mercy, why don't you help us out with the first question?
Yeah, absolutely. This is exciting. We've got a few questions coming in here. So Lori, while you were all talking, asked, what about the link between our general militarization as a country and in our foreign policy? Can we talk explicitly about that connection?
That's a great question. And, you know, I think we definitely don't negate that. We're not doing international work, but there is I do believe, and I think it's completely comprehensive to say, that there is a direct connection between state policy, federal policy, and what's happening on a global stance. And it's very much noted. I'm trying to find the right words. The United States is not invested in civil society in the United States. And such, we do not have a CEDAW passed. We, have pulled out of the World Health Organization. We have created a militarization in almost every avenue of our lives, and nobody is analyzing that in the way they should be. And it is unfortunate, and there needs to be more done. And I think in most cases, we do also align our work with some of the more international organizations, but we're really domestic. And many women's funds throughout the United States are working within their communities to tie in a much more human rights approach to the work, which is in some ways a pushback on the militarization that's going on in our federal policy and where that stands, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you, Lori, for your question. We have two questions from our friend Sandra Davis. What can and how can individuals get involved that can make an impact? And are there any visual artists or arts organizations that you partner with to help with fundraising efforts?
That's a great question. I actually don't want to call out any specific organizations, but I would ask you to, I'm sure Washington area has some, and so Women's Fund, so Women's Foundation, so you can contact Martine, I'm sure, and her team, and they can give you a list of some of the groups that they're working with also. Ms. is a national funder. I don't believe have any direct funding going into any organization specifically in the Washington, D.C. area. We do fund and have made a grant to the Washington Area Women's Foundation and the work that they are doing with women and girls of color. And so they may have some direct recommendations. I always find it really hard to call out any one. If you ask me for one organization, I give you 10. I'm sure Martine does the same thing. But I think, there are, absolutely the multiple forms of movement strategies, including visual and the arts, are critical to relaying message and making change happen. Martine, do you have any for that?
Yeah, I actually had a colleague ask me about in regard to how individuals can get involved to make an impact. And of course, we're a public foundation as Miss Foundation, so I have to say, well, you can donate if you can. But I think that I'll say what I told to this colleague as well, in that, if there are individuals who are looking to really volunteer in some way, right, volunteer their time, give up their time and their treasure and their expertise, if there's an organization that you have a long history with right now, given the pandemic, given how much additional burdens are being put on nonprofits on the ground, I would say to really look at those organizations you already have a connection with, to go to them first. Just because it's a little bit difficult, I think, for nonprofits to develop new volunteer relationships and protocols in this time. But I will say beyond that, if you feel like you don't really have an organization that you have that strong relationship with, everybody needs to vote. if you're eligible to vote, we all need to vote right now. if you're able to protest or write letters, call your representatives, that is definitely going to make an impact right now. And honestly, you know, in this moment in time, it may be that time when you feel like you're going to go out and educate yourself. A lot of organizations, including Washington Women's Foundation, have educational resources now on our website around gender equity, around racial equity and justice, and, you know, really go out there and educate yourself. And it may be the time to have that awkward conversation with that one relative that you've been avoiding since 2016 in November because you just didn't feel like you could handle it. You know, we have to, for any of us who, especially who are white or white presenting, I would say that, you know, it is the time for us to be talking to our white and white presenting peers and really taking on that burden ourselves. So it, you know, not what we would normally think of as volunteering, but it is absolutely a critical moment and a critical use of our time right now to be doing those things.
I think the other thing is to understand that nonprofits are under extreme pressure right now. And so when we're reaching out to them, what can we do? Really listen to what you're being asked to do. And so everybody has some version of what they can do something. And if that something is $1, you know, $1 a month that goes to an organization, it is going to help significantly right now. And if that is that you're going to use your time to host a conversation with a friend, then you should do that right now. It's really important that people figure out what they can do and then listen to what's being asked of you, because sometimes people are like, well, I really wanted to donate my time, but they were too busy. Well, but why are they too busy, right? Because they are underfunded. And so, you know, what does that look like? You know, women, so many women in so many organizations are trying to make sure they're taking care of themselves, and themselves are being put on the back burner while they're taking care of their families and their communities. And so it's really super important that we listen to what's being said to us about what's needed. And so whatever that can be, and that's why public charities like Washington Area Women's Foundation and the Ms. Foundation, you know, your dollars add up because we're looking at it in a collective approach, and it's an easy way to be helpful. But it is also, you know, how do you educate yourself? And that's really so key. Thank you, Martine, for saying that, because a lot of times people are like, can you come? And I'm like, no, but you can, right? You can. So I think people just have to find their spot, ask the question. If you're not getting an answer, do not start another organization to make your point. But find out how you can do, particularly in this moment in time, find out how you can be helpful to another organization. Registering people to vote is critical.
Fantastic. So we've got a few more questions rolling in. So from our friend Joan, where this is such a need to respond to the immediate needs of women and girls of color during the pandemic, what are some of the innovative ways that you see organizations and funders addressing the long-term systemic strategies right now?
So, you know, one of the things that I think, I just want to put this out, the Ms. Foundation did not do a rapid response fund. We did not do a COVID fund. We believe, and because we've seen it, that women and girls of color-led organizations are doing exactly what they need to be doing right now, which is they are running multi-issue organizations that have social service and direct service components to it. They are doing it in the way that they are being flexible and pivoting. You know, we saw an organization that was working on reproductive rights, justice, and health pivot into helping to place people into housing. We saw, you know, organizations who were working on immigrant rights, moving into ensuring that people were registered to vote. I mean, there are a multitude of things that people are doing, and what funders need to do is trust that organizations are doing what they need to do in this moment, and actually trust that it's not just this moment, it's going to be 10 years from now. What we are seeing now come to light is around the generational change we need to see. So it's going to take time. And I think people need to give room for people to be able to stop and breathe, right? I think some of the most innovative grant making I've seen are opportunities for organizations to close their doors and give everybody a chance to just relax, because you had leaders of organizations and individuals working in nonprofits who were underpaid, who didn't have health care themselves, being asked to homeschool their child, provide those same supports to communities, and who haven't had a break, right? So when I see an organization who's been doing amazing work, organizing with rallies and protest marches and feeding their communities and making sure people are getting tested, take 2 weeks off, I'm not asking the question, where did my money go? I'm saying, if they are taking care of themselves, like the quote from Audre Lorde, self-care is an act of warfare. And we need people to take care of themselves. So I think funders who are really looking at the long-term movement strategies and self-care supports right now are going to be most beneficial in the long run. Because I say right now, this is about space, grace, and pace. The space to try to figure out what needs to happen and not just assume that we have the answers. The grace to know that we might not be right all the time. And the pace to know that we are in this for a long haul, and we have been in it for the long haul. Well, the wake-up call is just going on for some. Some of us have been doing this work in our communities really close to the ground for a very long time, and some of the wake-up call is just exhausting.
Before we move on to the next question, I just want to I don't know if it's appropriate, but say amen to that. But also, I think the trust piece and the humanization piece, like basically, you know, what you're talking about is recognizing that we are people, others are people, different people have different needs. Let's respect that, let's honor that, and let's make sure that none of us, you know, have an emotional or mental or physical breakdown in this process. And so I would just second the really trusting our partners. You know, we should be reporting, philanthropy should be reporting to nonprofits right now and always about how we are going to be more accountable to them. I mean, in particular for public foundations, you know, our dollars are our community dollars, right? And I hope that private institutions will also sort of recognize the history of where their wealth came from as well. But, you know, in this moment in time, our grantees, same thing. You know, we check in with them. They're doing whatever they need to do. And we absolutely are following their lead. They're telling us. And that's how it should be.
Private foundations right now have a greater responsibility to the work. Public foundations have always had an accountability. Private foundations have not, and private foundations need to. And they need to reassess how they're approaching their work and what long-term approach looks like. I mean, we're seeing some really great stuff, I think, out of the Ford Foundation with their social bonds. And how are we able to, you know, those with endowments, pull down more money? What does it look like if we actually build endowments for women's organizations, which oftentimes do not have endowments and they're very limited in what they do? So really looking at all of those things. We will not take down the patriarchy on $1 million a year. Not going to happen.
So we're almost out of time, but we have one last question, which kind of helps wrap us up here. You mentioned the great work women's foundations do. How can men, AKA the guys who get it, support your organizations?
So super easy. When we are fighting for the work that we're doing, we are fighting for gender equity and equality. That is not limited to a gender identity. So men, gender non-conforming, trans folks should all be in this fight. And you should be asking the question, what does gender equity look like for yourself? And what does it look like in your community? And as we redefine it. So the work of the Ms. Foundation is inclusive and strategic and intentional. And it is about the movement towards gender equity and equality. And so we expect and hope that all folks will be part of this movement with us and engage in the conversation to help raise the dollars, to educate themselves, and to influence where the dollars are going. And that's, you know, when I say, you know, if we thought women alone could make all the changes happen of a system that wasn't designed for us or by us, we would have done it already. We can't. We can only do this if everybody is in it. There we go.
For our questions, everyone says thank you. And Martine, take us away.
I got so wrapped up in the conversation, I forgot how to take us away. I just want to thank you so much, Teresa, for your passion that you brought to the conversation today, for the passion you bring to your work every day, for being a champion for women and girls, for your leadership, and for the Miss Foundation's leadership. And just so everyone who's on the call can know, where can people engage with you and connect with the Miss Foundation and get the report?
Yeah, so simply you can follow us at Ms. Foundation, MS Foundation. You can also go to forwomen, FORWOMEN.org. That's our website, and up there is our report, our list of grantee partners, and the work that we're trying to do, including the strategic plan that I did very lightly at the top of the program. And up there, you can also sign up for our updates in all of our newsletters.
Perfect. I apologize, my oldest daughter came in to try to check to see if I was done working for today. So thank you everyone for joining us. I'm gonna have to go. It was an amazing and much needed conversation. We'll be doing more conversations like this at Washington Women's Foundation during our Ask Her series. So thank you, Teresa, for launching it off with us. You can check out additional Ask Her blog posts on our website. And we also encourage you to learn more about our Stand Together Fund and how you can get involved by visiting our website, thewomensfoundation.org. Please stay in touch. Thank you, everyone. Be safe and take good care.
Thank you.